their field school session. So I'm looking forward to that whenever it occurs sometime this fall. All right, at this time, Jack Wynn's going to introduce our guest speaker. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Danny.
I just confessed to Llew that somehow my well marked up introduction was left on my kitchen table. So what I want to do is tell you about Llew Kinison. He is an archaeologist with the New South Associates and travels around the Southeast mostly, following up projects that are actually getting a lot of projects started. And he's has a master's degree from University of West Florida. Really sharp people down there. So I expect he's probably one of those. And I'm sure we'll find out tonight. He's going to be talking about the King site. And I've asked him to expand on what the King site is and why we should care. It's one of the more spectacular sites excavated here in North Georgia in the last 30 years or more. And Dr. Dave Elliott.
David Hally.
I'm sorry. I'm having a senior moment here. Forgive me. I hate to complain. I hate to say that, but anyway, it just blew away. The project was going on for about 20 years, but there'd been some previous work to that. But the major work produced a volume about this thick on the King site, and it wasn't big enough to put in the appendices. So there's a CD inside the back cover of the book. It's an incredible amount of detail, and he worked on it, like I said, for 20 years with various student groups out there. And we're going to benefit from some of the results of that because Llew has been working on trying to interpret women's work in the village based on the lithics that they made and used. And that may start off sounding kind of dull, but in fact, I'm fairly sure you're going to be thrilled. This is a neat idea here. He's making some conclusions based on the examination of the lithic scatters within the village. And I think maybe I've probably blundered along enough. Llew, why don't you come out and talk to us? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. That was a great introduction. I'm just going to get right into it.
Good.
So the King site is a large fortified village located in Northwest Georgia on the Coosa River. It's part of an area controlled by the Coosa people. So they would have been like the paramount people in charge of the region, but it's actually a smaller like sub-region of the Coosa area called Hally. This site was almost certainly visited by at least one Spanish expedition, either the Soto or the Luna expedition, possibly both. They both went through the area where it was, but it's possible that this village didn't exist until after De Soto went through the area. So from the Spanish documents, we know that this is likely the town of Pica, and it was occupied probably between 1543 and 1600 AD, after which it was abandoned. So we can see here, this is where the King site is. And then the actual town of Hally would have been one of these two sites. Both of these sites have a mound, a pretty substantial mound. I'm pretty sure this one is the Coosa Country Club, which is the site that most people believe is Hally. And so the King site is a little unique because it's the westernmost of this cluster of villages and is also on the periphery of their territory. So that may explain why it was so fortified and had like a palisade and a ditch. Okay, so the first mention of the site that later becomes known as the King site is it's mentioned in the newspaper that after several large floods in the region in the 1880s, people have started finding skeletal remains and grave goods from an Indian site. And so then later in 1928, Margaret Ashley, who's pictured here, came down and she did a huge survey of Georgia. This is actually her at Etowah. And she comes, she looks at the site and she's like, hey, there's not a lot here. Most of it's already been taken by the people that found it. And so she has a little look around and she documented one burned structure and several exposed parts. And she found one intact pot. And she's like, well, it looks kind of like Etowah culture. This is what I got. And then it's left alone until the 1970s. So,
Wow.
yeah. So the WPA, they just gloss right over it. They just use her notes instead of doing their own excavations out there. So then in 1971, Patrick Garrow hears that the landowner out at the King site is planning on doing some deep plowing of the site. And he's like, oh man, you know, I heard there's a village out there. I'd love to get some students out there and have a look around. And so he ran a few volunteer field schools with shorter college students. And he quickly found out, hey, there's a bunch of stuff here. And I need help. I need help figuring out what's going on here. And so he contacts David Hally at UGA to run a combined shorter UGA fields. And so Dave Hally gets involved. Here he is. And he's like, wow, what a great site. And he gets National Geographic funding multiple times, which is kind of a big feat. Usually people get one round of National Geographic funding, he got two. And he's like, so what he did is he stripped off the entire layer of topsoil so that they could just look at all of the structures that they could see. So he looked at the ditch around the village, he looked at the palisade, and then he was also able to see this whole area where, you know, there were no structures that were, excuse me one minute, a cleared area in the center of the village. And the rest of the village on the eastern side was really well preserved. All of the houses had burned. And when you burn stuff, it sticks around in the dirt a whole lot better. Now, what he found out with his second round of Nat Geo funding is that the western side had been too damaged. So he went back in the 90s with that funding. And he was hoping that he would find like 28 more structures and more palisade, but that was not the case. That was unfortunate. So here we go. This is an artistic representation of what Hally estimated the village looked like. So we can see that cleared area in the center. We've got some sort of like status buildings here or public buildings. And then we've got all of these structures around the edge of the open plaza. We've got that big old palisade and the defensive ditch here. Did I miss anything? Oh, rectangular structures. So he separated the different domestic structures because these square structures that we see here, he called those primary domestic structures. And those were mostly for colder weather living. And then these rectangular structures that you can see here, I don't know how good of a job the artist did rendering them. You know, it's just an idea. But what they are is they're open air corn cribs. So you've got your like granary on top where you store your food, and then underneath it you can sleep in the warmer months is the idea. But I will be exclusively talking about these primary domestic structures. Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to launch into what I did. So my research is about stone tools produced by women. And the reason why I'm focusing on that is because for a very long time in our history, it's just sort of been assumed that stone tool making is like man's work, right? They make arrowheads, spearheads, But that's not really the case. The idea that this technology was available and that women would need to cut things of their own and craft things of their own, they would be the most likely to make those. And so what we're doing here is sort of going back to the old data from the 70s and the 90s and saying, well, let's add a little more nuance to it. And so what I did is I took my advisor, Rainy Goujon's model. He came up with this idea, which I'll get into a little later in the talk, about how you can sort of separate out these gendered activity areas where men work and where women work and where they worked together, specifically in houses. And so once I applied this model, I was able to look at those women's activity areas and say, hey, is there evidence of stone tool making here? And when I found it, well, that just led to more questions. What kind of tools were they making? How are they making them? Yeah, that's a good question.
Where the stone?
Yeah, exactly. And so this is sort of the boring part. I was expecting to talk to more students that day. That's my fault. But you know, how we structure our research is very important. And so this is just a slide to let you guys know that I will be talking about gender, space, and how stone tools are made. So for our first, we're going to talk about how stone tools are made. And this concept of reduction series that first came out of France, but it's widely applicable to lots of different sort of like series of how we make things. And why it's so useful to stone tools in particular is that once you break that tool and make it sharp, there's no going back, right? And so as you continue to break it more and more, it becomes a series that is ordered in a temporal way, right? You can't go backward. And how people break rocks and what rocks they break tells us about their culture. And so we're able to trace them, you know, over time and space. These are some French guys. I'm going to try and say their names, but they're the sort of like founding fathers of this idea. So there's André Leroy-Warren and André Georges Audricourt, and they're pictured here. And so here we have the chain. So you have someone getting a rock, they break the rock, and from here, you know, once your rock is broken, it's sharp. You can use it to butcher, or you can refine it even more. And so, you know, if you choose to refine it more, then you butcher an animal. Well, now it's not sharp anymore, and you have to resharpen it. So we're back to this stage again. And eventually, you're going to be done with it. Either the tool's going to break, or you lose it, or it's not sharp anymore, and so you discard it. And
This is Llew here.
this might not actually be me, because if we're talking about really old stone tools, this could be someone finding a broken stone tool and saying, well, I think I can get a little bit more use out of that. We see that a lot in Florida where there's not good rocks. So people bring rocks from Alabama, from Georgia, and you know that rock is precious. So if you can find it, resharpen it. So there should be another bit though. I agree. It's like right here, that's the actual archaeologist.
That's well done.
Yeah. Okay, so gender. Obviously, it's separate from biological sex. It's a role that is performed, and it's something that we reinforce in our own culture and in other cultures as well. You know, it's not going to be the same culture to culture. It's something that we constantly establish and fight against, and then reestablish with our own like cultural norms of how we do things. And often there is a division of labor based on gender. That's definitely going to be the case in this research. Okay, so now let's get into some theories about stone tools and gender. So back in the 80s, feminism came late to archaeology, but it did eventually make its way in. And we got people asking like, well, why are we assuming that women didn't make their own stone tools, use stone tools? And so the first person to talk about this is Margaret. And she said, women obviously needed tools to complete their tasks based on the gendered division of labor, specifically and often scrapers and blades, and that because they were the ones who needed the tools, they were the most likely to design them. You know, it's not like today where I can go down to the store and buy a knife. If I wanted a knife back then, I have to break a rock or find something sharp. And it's silly to think, oh, I'm going to wait for someone else to do that, when you can just grab a rock from right by the river, especially by the king site, break it once, you've got a nice sharp edge. And then we have Joan Garrow, famous for her piece called Gender Lithics, where she asserted that women made their own tools. And then in almost a tongue-in-cheek kind of way, said that the evidence of women's stone tools would occur in these domestic areas. You know, she was trying to look for them from a feminist perspective, like in areas where we wouldn't traditionally expect women to have tools or be like working stuff. But she said no, you know, based on the gender division of labor in the Southeast, women are going to be working in the home, and that's where we should look for them. We should look for them in house floors, and that's where we get into my advisor's research. This is Remy Goujon. He's at the King site, which is underneath Carter's Lake. They had let the lake down so he could revisit the site. Sorry, did I say the King site? This is the Little Egypt site. And he did his research there, looking for these gendered activity areas in these houses from the town of Coosa. And what he did is he looked at all of the artifacts in these homes and then tried to match them to the gendered division of labor and what specific tasks men and women were doing, based on the historic accounts that we have from the Spanish and the British coming through the area, and also of the descendant communities that now live out west. And so what he sort of uncovered was that there was this strict division of labor between women and men, but that a biological male did not have to perform that role, and a biological female did not have to perform that role. What he found was that you know, men could perform the role of a woman, but they were recognized as a woman. So archaeologically, we would just call that a woman's work area space. So there's not like a secret third gendered space in these structures that I'm looking at and that he was looking at. There's men's space, women's space, and probably children's space. Children are a big problem in the archaeological record. They don't act very rationally, and they tend to mess up activity areas.
Nothing's changed.
So here's an example of what these primary domestic structures look like. So we have an open hearth here. We have walls that are single step posts all the way around. We have these entrance trenches. And what's interesting is that these houses are technically like semi-subterranean. So this house basin here, it's dug into the ground, and then often a prepared floor is put down. So they'll bring in clay that will be warmed by the fire. And so it'll be nice when you're walking on it. It won't just be bare earth. And then they have these partitioned areas that you can see. And those will have benches for sleeping. And then the corners will typically be for storage. I think I have that broken down a little better. Yeah. So we've got the entryway, and then women sleeping area. We call this adult sleeping area because it's often the men, but honestly, in the southeast, men's activity doesn't really take place a lot in the home. They're mostly just waiting around to get back in to go to sleep and to eat food. Their activity areas are elsewhere in the village, usually outside or at the council house. But what's really interesting is that there is always a huge amount of lithic working right here that is attributed to men. And that is a pattern that extends beyond just Georgia and the Coosa culture. We see that all the way up the coast, probably to at least Virginia, and all the way down to the Gulf Coast. When you get these late Mississippi, yes?
You mean that there are specific areas where they live that they do this consistently across the whole?
Yeah, in the Mississippian period. So if you get a well-preserved house, you're always gonna have this lithic area here. Now, whether that's,
Is it always just inside the door?
yeah, just inside to the right.
Wow.
Yeah, and the doors, they change, but the activity doesn't. And that's what's interesting. Is that like as we go up into Cherokee territory, they like to put their doors in the center of the wall, not in the corner. And we still get that lithic concentration right there. Now, I don't know if that lithic concentration is necessarily that the men are exclusively working there. They might be working over here too. But I feel like they're at least gathering that material into one safe place because it hurts to step on this stuff. I've gone too far. Okay, so I looked at 3 of the domestic structures that Dave Hally excavated. Structure 8, structure 9, and structure 14. And while I'm here on this slide, I want to talk a little bit about the duration of the village, because some of these structures have multiple building phases, yeah. And so the theory is that the more times that it's been rebuilt, the older it is. And so structure 8 is believed to be a founding house, and that's going to be important to my interpretation later. Structure 9 is believed to be one of the more recent of the buildings, so built probably right before the village was burned or abandoned, or burned and abandoned. And then structure 14 probably actually comes after the village was abandoned. It may have been people attempting to resettle the village, or just not knowing that the village had been here originally. And that's because they are built right on top of a cemetery that goes with this village. And so I don't think that they knew where they were building. Okay, so another important thing that Dave Hally did when he excavated these structures. So I mentioned that he cleared off all of the land so that he could say, okay, that's a structure there, that's a structure there. But he also took soil samples every foot inside these structures. So what that means is he took samples that he could get really, really tiny artifacts out of just from those 1 foot by 1 foot squares, and he gridded them across the whole dang structure. So he would expose it and then do that sampling method. And that's what allowed me to do this, because the pieces of stone that I'm looking at are teeny, teeny, tiny. We're talking some of them less than a 32nd of an inch. Now, I don't know why I looked at them. Because boy do I regret it. But this is the breakdown of the samples that I chose to try and get at the women's activity areas in the center of each structure around the hearth. And then I also took a single sample from as close to the male activity areas as I could. And that was just to sort of have like a comparison. But the king site collection is not in the best shape, so it was hard to find certain samples. Some of the samples have been combined, and some of the bags have also started deteriorating because this was work that was done in the 70s. And so it needs some love, it needs to be rebagged, and what can be sort of fixed needs to be done. But that's why my samples aren't like all exactly from right where I need them. In case anyone was wondering why they're sort of random. Okay, so I looked at 2,785 tiny little pieces of rock from 27 soil samples across structures 8, 9, and 14. And then I sorted them into these size categories by pouring them through geological sieves to quickly sort them. Sorted them into raw material types as best I could. I basically used the comparative collection at UGA where the collections are housed. And then after those were separated into all the different rock types, I tried to look at the chips and determine more about it. So for each little chip of stone, I tried to determine the percentage of cortex. That's the sort of like orange rind of the rock. It's the part of the rock you don't want. You need to break away to get at the good stuff that's actually sharp. And so what the amount of cortex tells me is whether the chip of rock that is broken off is from the beginning of that stage, or if there's no cortex, it probably comes from later stages where they're thinning down the blade or trying to resharpen it. I then looked at if the flakes were whole or if they have been broken in some way. Because if you have a lot of whole flakes, it probably means that they used a soft hammer to break the rock, and that can be something made out of antler, bone, or wood. But if you have a lot of split flakes, it can indicate that they're using another rock to do that breaking because the force is so great that it puts all that force into the rock and causes the flakes to break before they even come up. I then looked at all of the raw material percentages just to try and figure out what the people at these three structures preferred. And then for specifically two types of rock, which was Knox chert and Fort Payne chert, I gave them special analysis because they were so abundant. The other rocks, I didn't feel it would be fair to compare them because I would get bad data. So Fort Payne, Knox, and Coastal Plain were the most predominant of any of the rocks that I was looking at. And those are all pretty close to where the king site is. The king site is a really great location for if you want rocks. A lot of them come right out of the river. They outcrop at the surface over there. And then the coastal plain is just a little bit down the river it's right by the fall line. And so you can get right down to the coastal plain from there. And so this is the breakdown showing the different amounts. Okay, so now my results. For structure 8, had a high frequency of small flakes, which indicated that they were sharpening or thinning whatever tools they were working on in this structure. I also had a lot of broken flakes, which indicated that they were using another stone, hard hammer. And then for my special analysis, I compared my data to a bunch of experimental archaeology, where these two guys, Bradbury and Carr, have just been breaking rocks into specific forms and figuring out what kind of trash that leaves behind, what kind of stone chips. And so they've been doing that for, I think, 15 years. And so they have a huge data set, which is great for doing these like quick comparisons. And so when I compared my data from structure 8 I confirmed that it was late stage reduction and edge maintenance, which is exactly what this was telling. For structure 9, had a high frequency of that cortex rind, which means that we were early in the stage. I had small flakes with cortex attached, indicating that we were actually at an intermediate stage of reduction. And then no indication of camera preference. That means I was split 50-50 on my split flakes and whole flakes. And then I compared the data with Bradbury and Carr and got this indication of early stage reduction, which doesn't really jive with what I've got going on here, other than the high frequency of cortex. And then structure 14 is sort of a sad story. The structure was very eroded because it's right by the river. And so I did not get a very good sample size. What flakes were left from the soil samples were mostly these larger flakes. And again, some of them were broken and some of them were whole. And so I feel bad. I kind of have to throw out this structure. It just wasn't a good thing to use. So by this point, I had hoped that I would pull out some sort of pattern between all these three structures. And one wasn't appearing, so I tried to prove with math that, you know, maybe there was some similarity between them. So I did a big chi-square test, which is just a statistic that checks to see how related things are. And it failed, which means that they're not related at all. But at least I did it with math. So now we're into the conclusion. So all of the structures were burned, and I was wondering, did these structures act like sort of like black boxes of activity, right? Were people like working on stone tools? Oh no, the village is on fire, got to get out of here. Or did they come back and like do some cleanup? 1/4-inch flakes were, these are the flakes that Bradbury and Carr said were most prominent in all of their studies. This is the amount that you should have for just about any kind of reduction other than like edge maintenance. But I had a very, very small percentage of 1/4-inch flakes. Most of my flakes were smaller than 1/4 of an inch, very tiny. So I assumed that this was evidence of sweeping and cleanup, that, you know, people were doing this work and then sweeping it maybe even into that section just to the right of the door, or taking it outside and putting it in a pit or the river, somewhere where you wouldn't step on it and hurt your feet. Most of the assemblage was composed of this smaller debitage. I've already sort of covered that. But I had this really high split flake percentage. And so what I think was actually happening was that because I was looking at the area around the hearth, that's a high traffic area, and whatever flakes were left there were being stepped on and trampled, as well as cleaned up. So that's where we get this explanation that most of my stuff is sort of affected more by human behavior than I thought. And then we get into the whole like fact that I was trying to look for a pattern between all of these three structures, but that I was sort of comparing apples and oranges and a piece of rotten fruit, right? So, structure 8 was that structure that had been rebuilt a couple of times. It was probably a founding household. And so it's likely that this was the home of an elderly woman, and that she might have, her practices of what she would have been making would have changed with age, because as you age, you know, you specialize more, you do less of like the everyday work. And then the structure 9 was probably the home of a daughter starting her family. And she has lots of tasks to do. She's got to look after her kids. She's got to do all of this preparation. And so she's going to have a different lithic assemblage than an older woman might. And then my piece of rotten fruit is structure 14, which is it's too damaged by the flooding and the plowing that occurred at the site. So my conclusions are that at least I could sort of prove in these gendered activity areas, flint knapping was happening, right? Stone tools were being made. So that's one big step. I was also able to look at the stone tools and at least determine something about them without even using a microscope. This is all just me looking at the flakes. But really, we need to do much more research on this kind of stuff. There's lots of structures at King. There's lots of structures at Little Egypt that have been excavated. There's a whole host of these Mississippian villages that have similar layouts. And someone needs to get out there and tie it all together, because Dave Hally did King, Remy Goujon, my advisor, he might pull together something on Little Egypt. I don't know. But yeah, we need more people to start looking into this kind of stuff. And that's my hope. I hope that future archaeologists continue to look for stone tool production by women in the past and compare it to similar assemblages across the Southeast. That's it.
Thank you. Question there? Questions?
I got one right here.
So I was curious, because obviously I don't have the same background that you do for the site. I was wondering if there's a reason that maybe like since structure 8 was showing more like refined, like late stage kind of evidence, like maybe they were focused more on refining. Maybe it's a familial thing rather than a gendered activity, especially because it seems to be a shared space overall rather than separate within the household. Maybe it's the household itself specializes in one type of tool, and then it's a gendered activity when they're actually performing the role later on.
So one of Dave Hawley's students did actually look into if the village was acting as one of those sort of like workshop sites where that kind of production was occurring, and that's not the case. But that doesn't mean that it isn't what you said, sort of a shared space. That's something that I really had to wrestle with this model, because the only way to accept that these gendered spaces exist is to commit to the model.
Yeah.
And so, I went back and forth with my advisor a lot about like, oh, are these just communal spaces? Like, what's going on? And he said, well, the only way that you get to anything is if you build that chain of reason. And so that's kind of what I had to do. But I agree with you. It could just be a communal space.
I think I understand what tools that a male would be making, and then what the different tool that a woman would be making.
Sure.
Woman doing more of a scraping, cutting type tool.
Yeah, exactly. So
what my
any sort of
question is how do you tell the difference between the flakes and the pieces that you found?
yeah.
I'm concerned about your 1/4 inch size. Were you not finding artifacts larger than that?
Oh no. Just in these soil samples. Yeah.
Well, okay.
No. They were finding plenty of much larger artifacts, usually on the periphery of the structure, though,
Okay.
and in like
Did
specific
you ever
discard
feel
areas.
if they were sort of swept off toward the wall?
That was my guess.
Yeah.
I think David might be talking about some sort of use wear analysis on the lithic flake.
Yeah, and so I wouldn't be able to get at that with my macroscopic analysis. That's microscopic. That's part of that more research is necessary.
You said that a lot of the cortex flakes in structure 9,
Mhm.
you said that a lot of the lithic material was readily available in the river
Mhm.
or near the fall line.
Yeah.
Can you be more specific about the types? I know you had something on the slide about that. Okay.
Yeah. So I had this might not be the best. Where's my Longview limestone? Oh, it's in structure 14, the garbage one. Okay. So quartz is sort of readily available in this area in North Georgia. Knox Chert is probably just across the line into like Tennessee and South Carolina. But it does outcrop a little bit in these mountains. Your most common one is going to be Fort Payne, which is sort of a brownish green camo colored shirt that sometimes has these like whitish nodules in it. I think I have a core picture. That's probably a better picture there, but that's it there.
Most of this was formed, when the edge of the sea was
Oh yeah,
up there. In the
these are billions and billions of little quartz crystal critters with a little quartz shell dying in their billions and forming those layers.
Fort Payne is Fort Payne, Alabama,
Right across the line.
Yeah,
right at the line, right
yeah,
across.
but
the-
it the sort of like vein of it goes all the way through the southeast though. And then coastal plain I sort of already touched on. You'll see that a lot of stuff in here is like thermally altered or heat treated. I divested myself of that because the village was burned. So I can't separate out what was intentionally heat treated versus what was just altered by the temperature of the fire.
You know what time period the village burned?
Oh yeah, right around 1600.
So they just abandoned after the fire.
Yeah,
Is that a ritual burning or is that a war
I can't say exactly. It could have been that, you know, after the Spanish came through, they were decimated by disease. They were also attacked by the Spanish. They could have said like, oh, we're done with this. We need to consolidate our power elsewhere and burn the village themselves, or someone else could have burned their village. The Spanish could have burned their village and just not talked about it.
But one of the things that we hear from the De Luna expedition that came in about 20 years later, they were expecting a big town with lots of food, fields of planted corn. And 20 years later, it was just a little village and there was almost no food.
Mhm.
And the fields that they'd expected to see were standing up in 20-year-old pine trees.
Yeah. Yeah, and Luna was pretty desperate by that
Oh,
point.
yeah,
He sent his cavalry up north to try and find food. And they came back with very little.
So some of this cavalry were part of DeSoto's troops.
Mhm.
And so that's why they thought that stuff would be there.
Yeah,
And didn't realize the whole community collapsed like that.
yeah, that you bring up another thing that I just wanted to mention from the Spanish. This sort of rendition of the house. The Spanish describe these houses and they say that they had crops growing up on top of these roofs, which I think is pretty neat. And also that this earthen mound around the edge of it was really piled on there. So I don't think this artist's rendition is perfectly accurate, but it does the job for what I'm doing. But
Well, the idea of a subterranean house by excavating out some of the soil,
mhm,
then you pile it back up on the outside.
as
And
insulation.
it insulates the inside of the house and keeps some of the critters out.
Mhm.
You said- There's another advantage to that, which I can't think of right now.
It probably provides a lot of stability to these walls that are just made out of, you know, dried clay and cane mats.
Yeah, the wattle and dog walls, yeah.
Yeah,
Seems like it'd be pretty dark in there.
yeah. They have this central hole up here, and then they've got the fire.
The fires kept going all the time to keep the room dry. Otherwise it'd get moist and mungy in there.
Yeah,
It must have been pretty dang smoky.
Yeah.
that's why they got this smoke hole up top.
But it's
But
still-
yeah,
It hang
It's still
stuff from the rafters to smoke.
Laid on the floor.
yeah. And I think there's a lot of evidence that they clayed all of this exposed wood too.
Yeah.
To keep it from catching fire.
Did they ever find any wood tools there? Or is it all just stone tools?
Doesn't preserve very well in the archaeological record. Now, these did burn, but I think I remember hearing about some kind of like carbonized wooden pin that was some kind of like scratching device, but no, you need to read Dave Holly's really big book.
I've got a copy of it. I was intending to bring it, but I forgot it tonight.
It's
Yeah, it's there.
extensive.
Is that just about these excavations?
Yeah, just about King. Yes.
When I was I was superintendent at Etowah Mounds,
Mhm.
we had an exhibit there. A beautiful, I mean, 1500s period Spanish sword.
Yep, I knew someone was gonna bring it up.
Yeah. And I know these guys, they were like hippie looking guys, but
Mhm.
they said they just kind of was in the ground. They kind of stumbled
Yeah.
on it. That's hard to believe, but that's what they said.
Yeah,
And then I think there was a lawsuit over that sword.
there was.
There was.
And then that's the last I heard. What happened to it?
Yeah, so several Spanish artifacts were found at this site. Those include things like iron nails, axe heads, and I think a knife, and then that sword.
Those have been trade goods?
They could have been salvaged from a battlefield, or they could have been given as gifts. That's sort of the wishy-washiness
I
of
was
it.
never able to pinpoint whether it was a burial item or it was just something separate from any kind of burial.
They certainly claimed that it was a burial item
Okay.
and that they took it off of this farmer's property, and the judge still let them have it.
The story I heard was that they were sitting down for lunch and realized they were sitting on it.
Yeah, I don't buy that.
Yeah, that sounds too good to be true, but.
Yeah.
Where do they hide the shovels?
So what'd you say happened to it in the end?
In the end, they got to keep it. The judge sided with them because the landowner didn't try to reclaim the sword in the appropriate amount of time. The statute of limitations was up.
I've heard they sold it. I
I
don't know.
would be surprised if they didn't. When you think about the
Yeah.
whole situation.
But I do know that Dave Hally was trying to sue for it to belong to the state, and that never happened.
So how long does it take the landowner to say, I want this back?
Right, so that's where it gets a little contentious, is he said that pretty early on, and the UGA archaeologist said, no, don't claim it because we're gonna make sure that it's gonna stay in this museum.
So it didn't.
So he didn't, and then
Later, it says,
the judge said, well, you should have.
You should've.
Yeah, you should have said that you wanted it, and when you wanted it,
yeah.
yeah, it gets,
Yeah. that's what I was wondering.
I have no idea where the sword is today.
Because they sold it.
Well, they either still have it in their
Who's
house.
they that sold it?
It's 3 men that found it,
Not the landowner,
right?
not the state or.
Right.
3 guys.
But it went through at least 3 or 4 different hands.
Well, yeah, but it's the property owner's sword. I mean, it's on his
Yeah,
property.
Yeah, that's what Georgia law says today, but in the 90s, I don't, or 80s even, I don't know if that's true. I think this got settled in 89.
But today, you find a sword, it's the property owner's.
But also,
But they're not gonna take
the
it
property
away.
owner would be told right quick that it was his and not somebody else's.
And also, if it did come out of a burial, a whole other chain of events would happen with the state.
Were there burials underneath these structures, 8, 9, and 14?
Yes, there are burials under every structure. Typically, people in the southeast are buried under where they slept.
But were you digging out at the King site, or you just
Me?
analyzing old?
No, I
soil
was looking at
samples?
stuff from the 70s.
Okay, gotcha. But is there any digging going on today? But
No. It's just a nice little field in the bend of the river.
So no professional ever examined that sword. I mean, no one that.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
There's Lots of
Yeah.
examination.
There is a paper about that sword too, I think.
I think so too, but I.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously it's gotta be Spanish, but I mean, what's confirmed.
Oh, yeah, they went through a
Yeah.
whole lot of analysis to
Yeah.
figure out the date of the thing and characteristics of it.
Yep.
This, your advisor, Remy Goujon,
Mhm.
Yeah,
wasn't one of the earlier French guys Did
Oh,
they
no,
have the
it's
same last name? Are
different,
they
different
related?
last names, no,
Oh, Guru, okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Ryan.
Leroy Gould.
My bad.
This research you were doing was part of a degree you were getting?
Yeah, this was my master's thesis research.
Did you get it?
Oh, yeah.
Very.
I think you did a
You've
great
been
job.
throwing out the.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
In position, more in fire.
Did you see this?
That fascinates me.
Oh, yeah.